All right, the director of the council office just poked his head in the door and confirmed that we are indeed on the Metro Nashville network. I will go ahead and bang the gavel. This is a special joint committee meeting of the Public Works and Planning, Zoning, and Historical Committees of the Metro Council. My name is Freddie O'Connell. I both represent District 19 and chair the Public Works Committee, and I'm pleased to be joined by...
Oh, yes, I'm the chair of the Planning Committee. I didn't know the mic was on.
Yeah, there you go.
I appreciate we doing this meeting. I think people want us to address the issue of traffic in the city, and so appreciate the co-hosting the meeting.
Great. We are joined also by staff from the Metro Public Works Department, Metro Planning Department, and Metro Nashville Police Department, who would be involved in enforcement on some of this action. And we're going to have two presentations tonight. One is updates to Public Works traffic calming program. And the other is basically looking at the Metro Council last year, or maybe earlier this year, requested a feasibility study on background speed reduction in various parts of the city. And so Public Works staff are going to take us through both of those, I think. Derek, am I correct that we are starting with you? All right, I'm going to turn your mic on, and we've got presentations on both pieces. Okay, you should be live.
All right, so hello, testing. All right, sounds like we're working. Just to introduce myself, my name is Derek Hagerty. I'm with Metro Public Works as a transportation engineer. And today I just want to do a quick run through of our traffic calming program. So to kick things off, I want to define what traffic calming is as we use the term in Public Works. It's simply the use of physical solutions to reduce traffic speeds. So that can be anything from signage and pavement markings up to speed cushions, traffic circles, and anything in between. Now, this year, we've seen some changes in the program as of 2019. So the new things we're seeing, one, this was the first year in at least the past decade, probably going further back, when traffic calming was its own line item in the capital spending plan. So because of that, we took this opportunity to revamp the program. So a few things we changed. One was starting biannual evaluation periods. In the past, evaluations of neighborhoods was done on a rolling basis. Obviously, that leads to a few issues. One, let's say neighborhood 1 gets an evaluation in July. Perfect weather, school's out, different set of factors than neighborhood 2, which is evaluated in January. School year, rain, snow. So we're working with different factors there, not necessarily the most even playing field. What it also allows us to do is either tell neighborhoods right away that, yes, you're getting a project, we're going forward, or asking them to reapply during the next evaluation period. That way we're not keeping neighborhoods on the hook for 5-6 years waiting for a project. And then the other big thing, which I'm going to get to next, is the institution of an application process. So this is something we borrowed from a few other cities across the country. Boston Slow Streets program was really one of our big programs that we borrowed from. So to go into the application process a little bit, it's a 4-page document. And we accept these twice a year, once in January, once in July. And I'll get into what our experiences were in January a little bit later here. But the application, 4 pages. The first page is just one of two things, either a neighborhood organization putting their information on there saying they're looking to apply, or 4 residents, unrelated from 4 different residents, putting their names on there too. What we're looking for on that first page is just ensuring that there's buy-in from the neighborhood before we start committing resources to the project. Page 2 then is a list of the problem streets as the neighborhoods see them. We ask the neighborhoods to rank order the problem streets that they're seeing. That gives us a couple different tools. Number one, once it's time to do a project on those streets, we can say, all right, these are the ones that you originally came up with. These are the ones we want to primarily address first. Also, when we're collecting data, let's say we have 50 neighborhoods apply. If they all put in 4 streets there, it's probably not realistic for us to go collect data on 200 different streets in a timely manner. So this allows us to maybe just take the first one or two from a neighborhood, compress that data collection a little bit, makes it a little easier to get a quicker turnaround while still going after the neighborhood's top priorities. Page 3 just allows the neighborhoods to lay out the issues they're seeing. And finally, the 4th page, we just request a signature on there stating that before a project is constructed, we'll go around and collect signatures from 70% of residents signing off on a plan before we construct anything. And then 2, that projects will be, meetings will be held in a responsible, respectful manner. Just making sure everyone's agreeing to the program bylines. So why are we doing the application? I think I hit on it earlier, but 1, it ensures neighborhood buy-in, which is incredibly important. We don't want to begin a project, based on just one person's opinion. We want there to at least be a couple people buying into the project before we start putting our resources in. And then 2, it helps us prioritize the streets that we're going to be looking to tackle. The win, I think I hit earlier, 2 application periods a year, 1 in January, 1 in July. So once we get all these applications in, we'll go out and collect data. With that data, we plug it into our prioritization model, and that's how we choose the neighborhoods. So up on the screens now, I've laid out a model. I'm just gonna run through it really quick. We use a 100-point system, 40 points for crash history. What we do here is take the crash rate per mile per year over the past 5 years. The second one is speed. Here we measure the 85th percentile speed, so the average speed of the 85th fastest car out of 100 for the neighborhood against the speed limit. Neighborhood destinations, those are metro destinations within the neighborhood and a quarter-mile buffer that we believe encourage pedestrians, cyclists, children, and the elderly to get out on the street. So those include schools, parks, community centers, public housing, and libraries. Finally, active transportation. This is a category of a few different elements that either encourage people or force people into the right-of-way. So this, let me see here. Transit stops, bikeways, greenways. It also includes the percentage of lack of sidewalks along a street. All right, so that's our prioritization model. I'm going to talk through what we experienced during the January 2019 application process, then get on to our results. So first application window, January 2nd to the 22nd. Because this is the first time we've instituted this application process, we grandfathered in 44 neighborhoods that had applied to the traffic calming program in the past. So they did not have to submit an application this time. Going forward, though, they will to be considered for the program. We also received 42 applications from other neighborhoods. So if you look at the math up there, that looks like 86 neighborhoods, but some of those are crossovers, some we combined into neighborhoods, some of those were from satellite cities. So all told, when we broke the numbers down, we had 54 neighborhoods that we were collecting data and comparing. Of those 54, just one of the stats we threw up there, 36 of those neighborhoods, so about 2/3, had an 85th percentile speed over 35 miles an hour. So what we want to communicate is just because a neighborhood was not selected does not mean they don't have a speeding issue. We recognize that the vast majority of these neighborhoods do have speeding issues. With our resources, though, we can only tackle so many at a time. And that's really one of the big things we want to communicate to the neighborhoods that we aren't able to select. And then finally, we respond to all neighborhoods by March 15th. Being that this was our first run through this cycle, we hope that in the future that gets a little quicker, but still a month and a half turnaround for collecting data on over 50 neighborhoods. We feel pretty good about that time frame. All right, so above you now, in front of you now, is the map of the neighborhoods who applied, shown in blue, and the ones selected, shown in green. Next slide, I'm going to go into the neighborhoods we selected a little more, but I just want to talk about some of the trends we saw, mainly with the neighborhoods that were selected. They're in what I would consider to be this is probably not the correct terminology, but the 1980s Nashville suburban belt. Just looking at it, you can see that a lot of our speeding issues are most likely caused from people cutting off of the main arterials through these neighborhoods on their way to work. So you can almost see a ring around 440 on the outside of that where a lot of our neighborhoods were selected from. So we think this is because, well, really for two reasons. One, a lot of neighborhoods that we've been seeing, the speeding is caused by cut-through traffic. People that live in the neighborhood are going to treat it like a neighborhood. People that use it as part of their commute are going to treat it as part of their commute to get from point A to B as fast as possible. And that's just one of the trends we're seeing here. Now, the neighborhoods that we selected are the 8 here. I just have listed in alphabetical order. And they each had either one of either two characteristics. One, the crash rate was over 7 crashes per mile per year, or the 85th percentile speed was over 41 miles an hour. Now, I know there's been some, this is probably a stat you've all heard before, but for pedestrians involved in car crashes with speeds of 40 miles an hour or higher, the survival rate is about 10%. Once you get down to 30 miles an hour, that's 50%, all the way down to 20, that's about 10%. So these 40-mile-an-hour numbers, represent a real threat to public safety. And like we're saying before, there's over 30 other neighborhoods, 40 neighborhoods that are definitely having speeding issues. With this program, though, we're just addressing what our model is saying are the worst ones first. All right, and finally, here's all 54 neighborhoods laid out. This is probably hard to read on the screen here. This is also available on the Public Works website. But this just shows where the neighborhoods fell in our prioritization model. This is open for the public to see, readily available. And one thing I do want to talk about here, just because a neighborhood just missed the cut this time does not necessarily mean they're going to be picked up in the next cycle. Every application window, we start with a clean slate. So we've encouraged all these neighborhoods to reapply, but just because Oriole Place just missed the cut this time does not necessarily mean they'll be picked up next time. If we have 8 new neighborhoods that have higher crash rates, higher speeds come into the program, they would receive prioritization based on how the model plays out. Response to the neighborhoods, March 15th, we let all the neighborhoods know if they were selected or not selected. For those not selected, we encourage them to reply. We also directed them to Hub Nashville for any signage, pavement marking concerns, speed trailer requests. And we let them know about what Jeff's going to be speaking on next, the feasibility study to lower speed limits in residential areas to 25 miles an hour. Neighborhoods that were selected, we begin the process of setting up neighborhood kickoff meetings. So those kickoff meetings, we've had, I think, 4 of them so far out of the 8. The other 4 are scheduled. And all we're doing at these meetings is sharing a little bit of information about the program, sharing the data we collected from the streets within the neighborhoods, and also presenting a menu of typical traffic calming options. I'm going to show a few examples of those next. Just know that this is not all-encompassing. We also begin a preliminary design process. Bring in big overhead maps and have the neighbors come up and start marking where they're seeing issues and where they think we need solutions. We really want these projects to be neighborhood driven. You know, at the end of the day, I'm not driving down these streets every day. My kids aren't playing in the front yard. We want these solutions to come from the neighborhoods. Obviously, we're going to be there with engineering support and to give some ideas and best practices we've seen, but we want this to be a neighborhood driven program. So after this meeting, we go back to the office, put together a preliminary design, send that back out to the neighborhoods for review. Based on the process, they can choose to hold another meeting that we'll obviously attend, go over the information, or if they want to spread it, social media, door to door, we leave those options up to them. But obviously, we're willing to go through as many iterations as necessary to come up with a design that the neighborhood can agree on. At this point, we'll begin a petition process where we go out on the streets where traffic calming measures have been proposed, collect 70% of signatures before we begin construction. All right, so just a quick look at the toolbox. We really fall into 3 main categories: narrowing roadways. Actually, before I get too far, I just want to talk about the slides a little bit. So we have about 20 typical treatments that we show here. We have a quick description, a little consumer report fast fact table where we show how this has an impact in different areas of community life, everything from pedestrians and noise to speeding, which is obviously one of the hot topics. We use a picture from somewhere in Nashville. Neighbors are always generally, 4 or 5 miles away at most from any of these treatments. They can go out, see it, see the effects they're having, and then just list a few advantages and disadvantages. All right, but continuing on, mentioned pinch points, have a few examples of those here. Surface treatments, similar to speed cushions, and then intersection controls, traffic circles, raised intersections, have a few options. Like I said, this is all up on our website. If you have any questions about these, I'm happy to answer them. So finally, going forward, obviously with January being our first cycle, we've learned a lot about the process and identified a few additional outreach opportunities. Number one, community meetings. This is really how we did our outreach in the past and how we're going to continue going forward. We've also been working with the police department community coordinators to identify neighborhoods where they're having a lot of speeding concerns from. And that's been a great resource. They obviously hear more about speeding than probably just about everyone else in Metro Nashville. So they've really been tying us into neighborhoods where they're continuously responding to calls. Also, with the speed trailer requests coming through Hub Nashville, I believe in 2018, that was our #1 request. We had over 380 residents requesting speed trailers. So to those requests, one, we're getting those speed trailers out there. We're passing along their information to the police department, but we're also passing along the traffic calming program information, encouraging them to apply for the program. And then final thing I have on here, just additional feedback-wise, going forward, we're going to share more of the data with the neighborhoods that are not selected. We posted that on our website in the past, but we just want to make sure it's upfront in that first email so that they know, like I said earlier, we're not saying any neighborhoods don't have a speeding problem. We're just saying we have to get to our top priority ones first. All right, that concludes the traffic calming portion of this. Are there any questions before we move on to the speed reduction feasibility part?
Yeah, I think let's stop here from some Q&A, and I want to allow Chair Bedney to have an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure later the rest of the council will talk to you about it, but I have I'm curious to know of your relation with the planning department, if the lessons you're learning from going through this traffic enforcement, if you're sharing that information with planning so they can use that to improve somehow the guidelines they use for neighborhood design.
No, absolutely. Our criteria really came about from our work with the planning department along with the mayor's office. So we've been working hand in hand with them since this program has been revamped. And, one of the biggest things we've seen, and this is, I think, pretty common knowledge in the transportation engineering, you've heard me talk about 85th percentile speed. That's what we use as a metric now. In the past, that was used to set speed limits. So we'd go out, build roads, do traffic studies. The 85th fastest car out there, they said, well, that's probably a good idea for the speed limit. So that's how speed limits were set. Nowadays, yeah, I know. Nowadays, the theory's come a long way, and we want to design roads so that 85th percentile speed is where we want it, whether that's 20, 25 miles an hour. So that's some of the information we're sharing with the planning department, along with this menu of tools that we're recommending.
Okay, I would like you to make that information available to the council so we can see what recommendations you're making and keep track on what adjustments they are making.
I would also like to add to that, Councilman, that there are a number of ways that traffic calming is instituted in the county. This program is the biggest and most complete, but there are ways that this does happen, and some residents may be seeing this in their neighborhoods through different channels, and some of those being spearheaded by planning. So one example of that would be our bikeways development, where we're developing something called neighborways, and it really looks a lot like traffic calming. It is the same types of treatments, all things considered. And then the other way that's happening, and this is new to us, we've had a couple of instances come through the door on this, strongly related to planning, and that is through development projects. Where a developer will come in and say, hey, as part of this, we've had some public feedback, and we just think it's a good idea that as part of this project, we implement some traffic calming. So We do have a little bit of experience working directly with the development community to allow them to initiate and fund and plan and do the public meetings and all of that for traffic calming projects as part of those projects. But we want it all to look the same. You know, we don't want a driver to think, well, this was to recognize any difference from really any of those treatments. We want to continue to maintain these standards and potentially even these procedures as much as it's fitting.
And then one more thing, sorry, Chair.
Go ahead.
The other thing is I strongly disagree with your idea of asking people to reapply. I can imagine that from one year to the next, the conditions will have changed so much that people need to reapply. So that was my personal request.
Let me make sure I've got clarification on that. Are you saying that once applied that they should be like already available for reconsideration, that repeated application is not?
Yes, sir.
Okay, got it. All right, great. I'm going to go out to the floor. I saw Councilmember Henderson is on first, so we'll go to her.
Thanks so much, Chair O'Connell. I concur with that as well. I think after everybody's jumped through all the hurdles to apply, you should just consider them. I mean, I certainly feel like, you know, you could go back to the neighborhoods and just check in with them, but they shouldn't have to apply again, so I concur with that. In that same vein, and first and foremost, thank you for improving this program. It's something that this council has cared a lot about, and I think we all felt and knew from neighborhood advocacy that the previous program was not working and was pretty anemic. So I'm so glad that this council is dedicating funding to that, and this program is more robust. In this transition period, though, related to kind of these grandfathered neighborhoods. So you have some neighborhoods who I think have just recently gone through the program that I would assert were basically kind of the old practice, right? Streets and neighborhoods that you just know would be really well suited for 20 or 25, but through the old program, 85% rule reinforced the 30-mile-per-hour speed. And so every neighbor was begging for a lower speed and other stuff. And then, you know, the Metro just went back out and painted 30 miles per hour back on the street. And neighbors are ticked, you know. So those folks that are just kind of on the cusp, I wonder if we might just be mindful of that, because if they have to kind of go all the way back around, I don't know if stuff that has had recent data collection, if there might be a window there where, you know, best practice now might say, and given the transition where they're going to make anyway, that street should be 25. So I'd ask you all just to think about how that might be handled in a fair and transparent way. But I think there's quite a few neighborhoods that recently went through the program that were very disconcerted that their 30-mile-per-hour speed was just reinforced, okay? And then as it relates to data, something this council and our committee have talked about quite a lot is that there's not a good reflection of almost crashes and near misses. And I often have constituents tell me that they called 862-8600 about a near miss, about being hit by a mirror, you know, put off into a ditch, something like that. And then, you know, they're just told by dispatch, okay, sorry. You know, there's not a report to reflect that having happened. I think that's important, especially since 40 points go. And absolutely, you know, life safety and actual crash. But so often in neighborhoods, it is the near misses and almost crashes that depress people's willingness to let their children bike where they want to go, to get out in the community and walk. So I would ask us, please, to figure out, we've been talking about that for many years. The Walk and Bike Strategic Plan highlighted the need for near-miss data. And so we've got to figure out a way. I know it's kind of left-hand, right-hand, MNP data. You know, if it doesn't have a police report, how do you do that? But we've got to figure that out. Additionally, regarding speeding trailers, I am not surprised that you got 380 requests for that. But you know what I tell neighbors? Frankly, don't bother, because the only people that slow down are conscientious people who would slow down anyway. And we do not, despite neighbors' requests, my own included, year after year, that we align MNPD enforcement with the speeding trailers, right? So if you don't align any sort of enforcement with the speeding trailer, because, I mean, it's just traffic calming theater, frankly. It makes people feel good that we're doing something, but it's not helping. So I would ask us, given how much those are requested, again, this gets a little bit into the MNPD space, but we have got to figure out a better way because council members ask for that, neighborhood association presidents ask for that. There is a logic in that. When the speeding trailer goes out, you have some concerted but random enforcement. Then that makes the speeding trailer being out even without enforcement more effective, right? But if it's never aligned with speeding enforcement, it just doesn't register or improve. So I just wanted to get those on the record, and thank you all very much for improving this program.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Henderson. I'm going to see if Metro Police want to respond to any of the issues about enforcement raised there or to any of that.
With regards to the reporting of near misses or almost crashes, a crash is defined by the state of Tennessee through the Tennessee Code Annotated. And they also dictate how we report those crashes. So that's state law. We, as Metro, really don't have a decision-making in that. And the Titan reports, the system that we report those, there is no way to report a near miss. A near miss is not a crash. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be something on the hub that is where they could report those crashes and it could be kept. You have to understand there's over 36,000 crashes in Davidson County that officers have to respond to. And you can only imagine how many near misses there probably are in addition to that. So the resources to go out and actually do some sort of physical report from the police department, I wish we had those kind of resources, but we just don't.
I do appreciate that. I would not suggest that you would need to go out for a near miss, but
Right.
to your point, whether it's hub or
Yes, there could be an
862-8600,
online-
there should be a way to register that.
An online reporting system for folks that would probably be very effective.
So I might
Thank you.
advise Public Works to note that and see if we can get something in Hub to that effect. And Councilmember Henderson, that even if it's not an 862-8600 call, at least we would have some place to have some data on that, and I think that's very helpful.
Right, and then 862-8600, I guess, could then refer people to that online
Sure.
place to register it, or, yeah, thank
Great.
you.
Did you have anything else, Councilmember Henderson?
I do not, thank
Okay,
you.
great. I'm going to move on to Councilmember Vercher. Councilmember Vercher, you ready?
Thank you so much, Chair. And I'm going to begin with, I came in on maybe midway of the presentation. I came in on the neighborhood buy-in, where it was expressed that we want to make sure that we have neighborhood buy-ins on projects, that we don't want to engage in projects where we don't have that neighborhood buy-in. Have we had projects where we didn't have neighborhood buy-in?
I don't know if I would phrase it that way, but we certainly have experience in this program, and it is the long lull in what we might all call meaningful projects is largely due to the fact that I think if we go back, and we got to go back 10 years talking about this at least, it was due in large part of not having really good buy-in from the neighborhoods. Even some of the more recent projects that we've done, we tell people, one of the main messages we give them when we have these meetings is that you guys have to be willing to stand up in the face of this, because when we put these things out, there's going to be a significant pushback against them, that not everybody in the neighborhood, not anybody in the neighborhood, and certainly people driving through the neighborhood are going to be in favor of it. We don't care about the people driving through the neighborhood. We're trying to kind of inconvenience them in a way. But we do want to make sure that we're going through this process hand in hand with the neighborhood, because they have to drive over these things every day back and forth to their house, and so do their neighbors. And so we do have some experience where these things have been put in and taken out, or put in and significantly modified. So we want to avoid that if at all possible.
Okay, and just for the viewing audience, can you qualify a meaningful project?
Well, for the past 10 years or so in this program, we have really done not much more than signing and marking. And while that does have some impact in certain situations, we know that is very limited. We certainly know the longevity of those impacts is limited. So we might have a street that has, let's say they're 12-foot wide lanes. They're pretty wide, and we can go in and we can put an edge line down 2 feet in and make them effectively 10-foot lanes, and say, well, we've tried to visually narrow the street and thereby slow traffic down, and that might work for a little while, but those impacts after a period of time are just not significant.
So, I always want to give credit when our departments, when they make an effort to address the council members' concerns. But I really want to echo what Councilman Bettany and Councilwoman Henderson stated earlier. I love the conversation, but this model really creates winners and losers for neighborhoods. To Councilman Bettany's point, many of these neighborhoods have been pleading and crying for some type of traffic calming measures beyond 10 years. And I'm a district council member where I've had children get killed, I've had vehicles run into homes, I've had crossing guards get hit, and I can go on and on and on. What frustrates me with the selection that was chosen, there was a study done for the most dangerous streets in Nashville. 4 out of 5 of them were in the Antioch area. None of those streets, neighborhoods were selected according to your model. So we have a huge gap in deciding your words that you just said. That's why I wanted you to qualify what a meaningful project is. Y'all are engineers. We're council members. We're not in the engineering business. We're in the constituents business. And what you're doing, you're creating winners and losers as it relates to neighborhood safety for the districts and neighborhoods that we actually represent. And Mr. Hammond, you know how I feel about this traffic calming project. I've met with you. I've expressed it in emails. You're almost there. You're not there. The other part that's missing too, that Councilman Bettany just asked, there's a huge disconnect between Public Works and the Planning Department. We wouldn't have cut-through traffic if your recommendation to the Planning Commission didn't suggest so. We wouldn't have all this traffic in our neighborhoods if we would have some type of traffic study. I went and watched hours of video, hours of Planning Commission meetings, hours. I could not find not one where a traffic study indicated that there would be detriment to a neighborhood or to a surrounding area. So somewhere the process is seriously flawed. What concerns me is that you alluded to the fact that the partnership with development, and I'm not saying that we should not have that. On our end of it, we're on the constituent side of it. A lot of these developers, my colleague to my right, she just had 2 community meetings. And here it is with her project, Planning Commission approving a project for traffic to go to combine commercial and residential. I guess the neighbors are gonna drive in the commercial parking lot. I don't know. I don't know how that's gonna work. But we have a huge disconnect, and we keep creating this endless cycle of solutions that's creating more problems. We're not solving anything. We're creating more problems. I go back to the neighborhoods that you picked. I'm not saying that they're not justified, because this is your model. You created these winners and losers with your own criteria. That's on you guys. But for our area to have some of the most dangerous intersections in the city, streets in the city, we got kids getting killed, vehicles running to neighbors' homes, and none of those neighborhoods was chosen. I mean, it's something is fundamentally flawed. And back to police enforcement. I have walkable neighborhoods out in my district. It does not work with police enforcement. So if MMPD can speak to, on any given day, how many police officers do we have that can patrol for neighborhood concerns? I know the answer, but I want you to answer it just for the viewing audience, because Councilman Bettany has been trying to get this into the budget, and without it, again, we're not solving anything. We're just going through the motions and adding more frustration to the constituents that we represent. Those signs and all that, my neighbors they don't even want it no more, because it's ineffective. They don't even want it. And we're at this point where, and I said this before, we don't want the public works to be like other departments, where constituents have to continue to go through a process. You make a decision, whatever it is, then they have to start back over and go through the process again. They're already doing that in property standards. We don't need to add that another layer, a barrier in the public works dynamic. Your public safety. This is where our constituents want to call and know, when they're having issues as it relates to their roadways, they can get them resolved and addressed. So I'm going to end with that, Chair, but we still have a lot of work to do. This model doesn't cut it. It's fundamentally flawed. I don't know what to tell my constituents when they know we have some of the most dangerous streets in the cities, and they're going to see, these other areas get these improvements. I don't have an answer. Maybe you have one. I don't know what a meaningful project is either. Maybe you can clarify that a little more. But if MMPD can answer the question, how many given officers we have on any particular day that can address these neighborhood speeding issues and neighborhoods, and that concludes my questions, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Verger. I will give MNPD an opportunity here.
I can't definitively answer on any given day how many officers are in each precinct. It depends on lots of different issues. The rebid process is every other year. Every 2 years there's a rebid process based on the calls for service that are analyzed, and each precinct is allocated a certain number of officers. One precinct, which may be larger geographically, may have fewer officers than a smaller precinct that the population is larger and the call volume is larger. How those officers are divided up, I can't give you an exact number. The precincts will, if you contacted the precinct commander, any one of the precinct commanders, they could tell you how many officers they have on their rosters. But it'll change from one day to the next with retirements, resignations, folks that are out on FMLA. It's just constantly changing. Each precinct commander is given the autonomy to determine traffic enforcement initiatives on their own, and they should have the resources at their disposal to allocate towards that. But as we all know, you have to prioritize based on immediate need, and high call volumes, violent responses that we need to respond to are going to take precedence over traffic, to be honest with you, enforcement. When you have folks that are calling in robberies or burglaries or domestic assaults, we can't very well justify leaving an officer sitting at a stop sign waiting for someone to come run that stop sign when these folks are having to wait for police officers to respond. We have to prioritize that and respond to those issues that create life safety problems right then and there. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, thank you so much. And I wasn't suggesting that. This is for the viewing audience, and everyone in the chamber. We're very well aware of that. The point that I was trying to make is that, to Councilman Bettany's point, there's a disconnect. The other piece to ensure that this works, we could talk about traffic calming all day, but if we don't have that law enforcement tied to it, it's never gonna work. I mean, it's never gonna work. We can put all the fancy lights and striping, and I know, because I have it in my district, it's never gonna work. They don't want another sign. They don't want another cute blue, white, green sign. They don't want any more. They don't want any more striping. I was told that the measures that we have to go through, you have to start with the least intrusive. and then you work your way up, and then you go to the, I guess, more intrusive. I don't know where we are in that process, and the neighbors don't know either. Again, I want to go back to, I think the conversation as it relates to traffic calming, starting the process to revamp the process for communities, but it's not a one cookie cutter approach. You have some neighborhoods that's more vocal, more organized. You have some neighborhoods, they're not even aware that this process even exists. A lot of neighborhoods don't even know they have these types of options. And by the time they do come online to apply, they're already behind the curve from the other neighborhoods that's been applying for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. If we're gonna just using your model as it is now, where neighborhoods that's applied, that was considered, didn't make the cut, and then have to apply again. This winners and losers approach doesn't work for neighbors that's looking for relief, immediate relief for safety, where they live, where their kids play, where their kids get on the school buses in our school zones. This model doesn't work. And I go back to, again, y'all are the engineers. I'm not an engineer, but I am in a constituent service business. And with that, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything in my power to express to you what my neighbors convey to me. And what they convey is that they want immediate relief.
Thank you, Councilmember. I've got Councilmember Syracuse next.
Thank you, Chair. Great job. Good presentation. Really appreciate the information. None of my neighborhoods were selected, but the overall feeling from my neighborhood leaders were that they really appreciate the whole communication throughout this process. So just passing that along. Especially appreciate the Pennington Bend neighbors, where they weren't selected, but you went above and beyond, I thought, and reached out and said, you know what, you may only need a couple things. And so I was just following up on that to see if you were still communicating with them as far as that goes. And then my second question, more fundamental question, is once you go through all this data collection and you implement a project, what then follow-up data collection are you doing to see what elements that you installed are either working, to what extent, and then do you go back and revisit that, and how does that then play into then the reapplication process and then the number of people who are selected?
Right, so 2 good questions. First one's really easy. Pennington Bend, still working with, I believe it's Mr. Lawler out there. Yep, I left him a message last week, just waiting for a call back, and I think we got a couple ideas that might be able to help him out. The follow-up, great question. I did not address that earlier. What we will do after all of these, go out, recollect the speed data 6 months later. This gives it enough time for neighbors, really all residents in the area, to become used to these measures. You know, first couple weeks after, we expect to see traffic slow down quite considerably. Waiting 6 months gives it time to normalize. And really, once these neighborhoods are selected for a project, you know, we're with them until we can get a solution to the problem.
Councilmember, does that get you? All right. Next up, we have Councilmember Elrod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate y'all doing this, because this is something that was one of the first things that I started working on when I came on the council, because that was when I went door knocking. It was one of the main things I heard about was speeding. And there's, for neighborhoods, I think we've heard from several others that this is one of the biggest impacts to quality of life in our neighborhood is, you know, whether your kids can play in the street, whether you feel safe walking, or even just getting out of the driveway. So I appreciate a more comprehensive approach to this, because, you know, of course, while well-intentioned, I think before it was kind of, you know, sporadic. And so I've got just some questions on how to, just for informational purposes for me, and how to, going forward. Is this traffic calming program, is it just for neighborhood streets, or does it include collector streets as well?
Right, so the focus of the program is on neighborhood streets. Let me just pull up a part of the application. We left the language a little vague here. We tell residents they may list local streets and collector streets, but the collector streets will be chosen at the discretion of the Metro traffic engineer. We're looking at two things there. One, whether this collector is a residential field, so based on a residential field based on the density of residents there, and also the volumes that these collectors are moving. With this program, we really don't want to impede traffic flow. What we're looking to do is slow down traffic, not necessarily divert it. So if we have roads that the planning department has designated as collectors, we want to make sure that we can still use those collectors to move traffic between local streets and arterials.
Okay, because I don't want to try to get into too many specifics, but I have a collector street that is very landlocked as far as adding sidewalks and that kind of thing. So that's something that I'm going to be trying to work on because it moves a lot of traffic and some speeding through there, but trying to slow folks down. So I appreciate that. And that'll be because I'm in a good situation where I had two applicants in my district. One was awarded a in the program, and another one wasn't. So then the dividing line was a collector street. So I guess also I would echo some other comments in that, and also I guess provide a little bit more context to some others. Is the neighborhood that didn't win is grandfathered in the next program. And I know it's tough, for me, I've got to explain to one neighborhood why one didn't get it and why one did. But, I think there's going to be winners and losers like that until we have, more funding to something like this. And I know it's probably tough that, some neighborhoods may have been working at this for several years, both of mine have been working it for several years. But then one that maybe has come on more recently, it turns out is more dangerous. So they may essentially skip the line as far as seniority or grandfathering or what have you, but it turns out they're more dangerous as some of the data that you showed as far as the crash rate or the speeding rate. But I would hope that the ones that are grandfathered in are just a check with those applicants of, hey, do you want to be included in the next round, yes or no? And maybe basically their application be reinstated for all intents and purposes. They don't have to go and fill out everything, get more, and y'all don't have to get more data. They don't have to get more data. I guess a question that I have, and this is trying to go forward, how many staff, or I guess how much staff is dedicated as contractors or operating money is this currently in the budget for, or currently allocated to the whole program? Do y'all have that information?
We do. The first question is staff, and Mr. Hagerty is our staff member assigned to this program. He has, since he has come on in the months that he's been with Metro, has basically taken this on himself. We have a contract in place to help support his work for primarily data collection. And so we work with a contractor for that. And then you all in, I believe, the fiscal year 19 funds appropriated $1.5 million earmarked to traffic calming and the speed limit reduction program, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So we're working with, we have roughly set that to be $1 million for traffic calming and $500,000 for the speed limit. So when we go to these meetings and working with the selected neighborhoods, we have that $1 million budget in the back of our mind.
And you may not, if you can answer this would be great, but I don't know if you can, but I think coming budget time, this will be a question that I'll have, is basically, can we quantify how much would it cost per neighborhood, per round for, that it costs out of that $1 million? I think that might be data you'll have to get perhaps in this first 6 months. And basically I'm getting it like if we increase it X, we can do more neighborhoods per year. Because, I think we need more, investment in, this program. I think we've been doing that the past several years, but also, in the police department and enforcement, because I think in a lot of ways they go hand in hand, but, hopefully a long-term goal is not to have police officers sitting out there trying to write tickets all the time, because, that's a bad use of resources. I think that's a bad way to change behavior. Because I'd rather people just learn, by the way a road is designed to slow down besides, hey, I got that ticket one time, or I know cops sit here, so I'm going to slow down just at this one point, but yet I know I can speed the rest of the way through this street or neighborhood or something like that. But I do think at least, some targeted enforcement is needed. and more investment is needed in this, but that takes more money allocated from the council. So that's something I'm going to be trying to see if we can prioritize as we get the budget presented to us tomorrow. And I've got a question I may not be able to stay for the next part, but I've got a question on the speed reduction as well, but I'll wait for that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next up is Councilmember Porterfield.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. I just wanted to reiterate some of the concerns of Councilmember Bettany, Henderson, Bircher, and now Elrod. It does propose a barrier when we're asking communities to reapply for the process when they've already put in the work to do the application the first time. So I would ask that you all listen to the suggestion of Councilman Elrod and have a way that those applications can be reinstated versus the community having to reapply each time. I also wanted to chime in on Council Lady Virtue's concerns as well. Being in Southeast Nashville, we do have a lot of safety concerns. There was recently a constituent in my district who was killed trying to walk home from work. So when we're talking about the equity of this project and we're talking about making sure that our communities are represented, we do want to make sure that we have a way for this process to be as fair as possible and to make sure that we're looking at the areas with the biggest safety concerns. So I hope that you all will consider that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Porterfield. Next up is Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would it be possible to back up to that graph that you showed? Because it may be that some folks who came in late hadn't seen that. I appreciate, engineer, I appreciate the systematic approach, of prioritizing by what are, to me, seem to be valid indications for what is dangerous. And I'm not sure everybody had seen that if they've just tuned in. That's how you're prioritizing, and not as opposed to who's been in there the longest or whatever. So I think that's important. And my question would be, you've referred to this as focusing on the local streets and the collector streets, and there was a reference earlier to dangerous intersections not being addressed by this program. So I would ask two questions. One, are dangerous intersections being simultaneously addressed by another program? And what's the system for prioritizing those? Or is there a way for y'all to work with neighborhoods or council members or somebody to make sure if the dangerous intersections should be addressed through this, to make sure that those get applied for by somebody? I mean, it may be that nobody thinks they own them and so nobody applied for them. So that's a complicated question. But if you can just address how dangerous intersections, which I would think tend to be arterials, are being taken care of.
These are two different projects, and it's nice to think that they're all safety projects and we should be all addressing them as such, and we would like to do that, but the dangerous intersection projects get into a much larger scale. The traffic calming program is a mitigation project. There's no way around it. I would stop short of calling it a Band-Aid, but these are efforts to try to go out and after the fact, after development decisions are made and after traffic does what it's going to do, we go in and try to bring some order back to the streets and do what we can with a relatively low budget and in a relatively quick turnaround to initiate some changes on the street in coordination with the neighborhood to lower the speeds and calm traffic in these areas. The dangerous intersections had capacity was a big part of it. Crash is certainly a big part of it, but they almost all got into adding turn lanes or rebuilding traffic signals or installing new traffic signals. At a minimum, probably $500,000 upwards of several millions of dollars per single location. So it's a totally different program with a different intent and a different purpose and different funding that goes along with it. So while we may be lucky and get into a neighborhood that has one of those dangerous intersections, the likelihood is not very good that we're actually going to address that high priority intersection with this program.
So it's a separate program. And then the second question was, how are you prioritizing the dangerous intersections? Is that a similar, whichever ones have the most crashes, or how does that work?
Right. So we had funding for the dangerous intersection programs about 2 years ago, and we made the improvements that we had the funding to do. I think we improved about 5 or 6 intersections through that program. That has not been rejuvenated, but the process is very similar. We look at crash rates and have prioritized the intersections by crash rate. That takes into account not only the numbers of crashes, but also the severity and also the traffic volume that is traveling through those intersections.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Allen, did that address everything on your end? I will now go to Councilmember Gilmore.
Thank you, Chair O'Connell. Good evening, gentlemen. I had a couple questions. I'm not able to see that. I think my eyes are getting bad. I just have to be honest. I used to think everybody's PowerPoint was messed up, but now I realize it's just my eyes are not what they used to be, and I can't see. So I would request that I could just, maybe you send it through our email so that we can see a little bit more closely. I just had a couple of questions. One was to, I guess, kind of drill in on what Councilmember Elrod had asked. I wanted to know, per project, I guess, what's the minimum and the maximum that you spend, even though it's like $1 million, I think you said $1 million in the department for this particular traffic calming projects. So how much do you spend per?
Right. So what we're spending on project is going to vary neighborhood by neighborhood.
Right.
Some neighborhoods maybe only a $10,000 investment. Some, $80,000, $90,000. We're going to do what a neighborhood needs. Obviously, keeping that $1 million number, in mind. And after we get through this first cycle, going back to both your question and Councilmember Elrod's, I think we're going to have a much better idea of what the average is. We have some numbers, thinking about $50,000 a project, but until we start doing these projects and see what it's going to take to solve these issues in the neighborhood, it's hard to quantify.
Okay, sure. And then another question I had was, now what is the reason that you had for neighborhoods to reapply for the applications versus just leaving those applications that have already been submitted? Why do you, what was the recommendation to clear them out and have them to resubmit them again?
Right. Really, that goes back to our buy-in philosophy that we're looking to this. And obviously, we've received plenty of feedback from the council here today, and maybe that process does become just checking in with those neighborhoods, ensuring they're still interested.
Okay. And then I think my last question is, in addition to this, do you have by districts some type of breakdown on the traffic calming projects that you have completed? Do you have that? I think that would be really good too, just so you could kind of see how that's looking in terms of, even though you have your matrix, and then maybe you could understand maybe some of the other issues that the council members expressed, and maybe just a different way of looking at it. And that's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gilmore. And that chart is on the Public Works website, so we can send that around as well. And I will go to Councilmember Pulley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief question or two. It looks like you had $1.5 million, did you say, for the traffic calming study in the 2019 budgets? Is that what you said, with $1 million going to the projects and another $500,000 going to speed reduction? Is that correct?
Correct. $1 million for this program, and then $500,000 for the speed limit reduction.
Okay. And it looks like you, based on the speed reduction study, yeah, it looks like $750,000 to $1 million it'll take to implement that. Does that come out of that $500,000, or is that a separate pot of money?
That would be the $500,000. Keep in mind, the $500,000 has not been spent. It's in that account with that earmark on it, but we have not expended those funds because we're not ready yet to begin initiating that change, which we'll talk about here in a minute.
Okay. All right. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Pulley, and I will go back to Councilmember Vercher.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to ask a question as it relates to funding for a project. So I know you don't know the cost of a project not until you actually, start beginning to actually do the project. So if a project goes over budget than what you anticipated, what does that mean for the other neighborhoods? Are their projects now deferred to a later point in time? Do they? How does that process work?
Well,
I mean, $1 million for for roadway improvements. I don't know some of the design for the particular neighborhoods, but it can become quite costly. And I hate to say this, but really $1 million really isn't a whole lot of money. So for a project to go over, what's the contingency for that? How is that communicated to neighborhoods that may fall off the wagon as it relates to their projects being able to be completed?
Well, we haven't crossed that bridge yet, and hopefully we don't. We try to be.
You will.
Yeah. We try to be very conservative. Picking the number of 8 to go with as part of that, we could have chosen 12 or 20 for that matter, but we're trying to be conservative until we get a few of these projects under our belt and have a better knowledge base to draw on. We have done some circle projects recently. We believe that 50,000 is a good number average for most of these neighborhoods, and so we're trying not to get ourselves to a point where we would rather bring on a new neighborhood and say, hey, we had some money left over. Let's see if we can get something small in for you guys than not. But if we do.
Are these 8 considered big projects for neighborhoods in comparison to what we've done before, where we had the money and we spread it amongst the county more, as opposed to now we're taking the pot and spreading it across the county in a smaller unit? Would you consider these larger projects?
I would say they are more meaningful projects, but we may go.
There you go again with that word meaningful.
Well,
you can't use that.
I'll try to do better to describe what I mean by that, which is when it comes to traffic calming, something that actually results in slower speeds, those are going to be things like the speed humps that we put in the street that you physically slow people down. They are more expensive, but in the grand scheme, they are not. It's not $1 million project. We're still in that $50,000 project range. So we have enough knowledge to know what it roughly costs. So I would say yes, they are bigger projects than what has been happening in the past. But I think even more so than that, in the past it wasn't about saving money as much as it was about don't do anything that doesn't ruffle the feathers of the neighborhood. And we've gotten past that, and we are working and willing to spend the money, but at the same time, some of those striping projects were a lot more expensive than what you would think, and so we want to make sure that the money that we do use is as effective as it can be.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond.
All right, at this time, I'm going to go back to Chair Bedney for some comments from the planning side of things.
Yeah, can you put the mic on the planning stuff?
They are ready to go.
All right, guys, I wanted you to speak about your interaction with Public Works. How do you take lessons learned in improving the guidelines you use to try to avoid traffic issues later on?
Well, we work with Public Works pretty much with every submittal cycle of cases. We have internal meetings where we sit down and look at the cases and talk about the street layouts and the street designs and the location of intersections. And I think it's a continual process with each project. Not each subdivision or case is the same, and a lot of times the street locations are determined by the topography of the site. And so I think there's a lot of different factors that go into the street design when we're looking at new streets and how those are laid out and what type of connectivity will be provided. We're looking at not just vehicle connectivity, but pedestrian connectivity. And so I think when we work with Public Works, they're reviewing the traffic impact studies when one is required and making recommendations to planning based on what they have determined from that traffic impact study, and then we're taking that information and sometimes applying conditions to the projects and sometimes redesigning the project to accommodate what the traffic impact study calls for. So a lot of times those traffic impacts, the cases that go to the planning commissions are generally the cases that are worked out and are recommended for approval. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that goes into the review of the case before it gets to the planning commission, and so the ones that are having problems sometimes get redesigned before they get to that point, and that's why you may not see a lot of conversation about it at the Planning Commission, because there's been months that have gone into the redesign of the project before it gets to that point.
I guess I didn't ask the question appropriately. So I was talking, I mean, I understand what you're doing with each project, and I appreciate it. You guys put an extremely amount of work trying to work with the developers into meeting the guidelines that you follow as positive, desirable guidelines for development. But you mentioned connectivity as if it's a guideline that shouldn't be changed. And I was talking more about the roots of the main guidelines you use as, why is it connectivity such a desirable goal for you to use, for you, I mean the planning department, to use as the city gets new projects?
I mean, I think connectivity goes to the health and safety and welfare. A lot of times when you have only one way in and one way out of a development, we're looking at that from a health safety standpoint, so that emergency vehicles have more than one way in and out of a development. The fire marshal requirements for single family are that if it gets over 30 single family lots, that you need a second point of access, or other measures need to be taken to address the issue. Sometimes sprinklers are required in the homes, but generally, when you get to more than 30 single-family lots, a second point of access is required. And so those are there's health safety issues that are that play into the connectivity issue that we're looking at, but we're also trying to find different ways to address it. I mean, just at our last Planning Commission meeting, there was a case where there was a lot of opposition from neighbors, and the staff recommended that there be a gated emergency access instead of a full connection. There's times that we are looking for different alternatives. Councilman Pulley had a case, the Monroe Harding case in his district, where we worked with the council member and with the neighboring properties who didn't want a straight through connection to their neighborhood, but a second access was required to meet the fire code requirements so that there wouldn't be variances requested. And so we found a second point of access that would not provide as much of a cut through. And so we're continually trying to look at connectivity and how that's done to still provide for different options, but not to create straight cut throughs that create problems.
And thank you about that. And you know that I brought up this before to you also, and we heard from the MMPD just before that they're focusing on life and safety and making sure that our citizens don't get killed and that sort of thing. So controlling speed it's lowered in the priorities with reason, because they are, we don't have enough police officers to serve the city. Having said that, I will encourage you to revise the fundamentals on how you work with the developers to take into account that we may not have the capacity to do the enforcement to keep people going through a certain speed. And Chair, if can I open to the floor to see if anyone has questions for him?
You can. I've got Councilmember Withers in the queue.
All right, there you go.
Councilmember, I was concerned that we weren't going to hear from you this evening, so I'm glad you jumped in there. Oh, hang on.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed the questions, the really good questions from some of my colleagues. I think to Councilmember Bednay's point about why is connectivity important, the disconnected cul-de-sac communities that were created in the middle part of the century were incredibly destructive to urban life. Frankly, were not conducive to healthy suburban life. They created the traffic congestion and sprawl that we are dealing with that leads to some of these very issues that building pattern created the problems that we're having today. And I think the solution is not to revert to disconnected cul-de-sac neighborhoods, especially in densifying suburban areas that need to be retrofitted in some cases to allow for connectivity and transit. If you have a neighborhood that is all cut up with disconnected streets and cul-de-sacs, you can live in that community and see something and see your neighbor's house, a friend's house, your school, your child's school, your church potentially, or a place of worship. You could see it and not be able to get to it unless you have a car. And that's the problem of what that creates. And so that's why that sort of gut reaction that a lot of folks have is I have to stop the cars because I'm afraid of cars. The solution isn't to create more disconnected neighborhoods. The solution is that you design the streets well, that you implement some of these traffic calming measures. I mean, I would say let's just go back to good old-fashioned four-way stop signs, which have been kind of hard to get, but they work. I mean, when I go and visit San Francisco, for example, it is on a grid system. They have four-way stop signs at every intersection. Plus, they also have speed humps, and they have some of those things too. But what you get is that you can have a huge amount of vehicular movement that is slow, that it is safe for pedestrians to cross, and it is so regular that in San Francisco, you can park not only literally at a stop sign, you can park at a 90-degree angle at a stop sign perfectly legally because that traffic is dispersed so well that they know that they're going to stop. And it's not that they have police officers on every corner, but they're designed well, and they're designed in ways that incorporate best practices of what we know works for traffic calming and dispersal. So that's just what I kind of want to caution folks. I totally understand why people are terrified of cars. Even in the urban neighborhoods like the ones that I represent, people are terrified of cars. And that's what people call me about all the time, too. But a lot of that just means that we just need to it was so impossible to get four-way stop signs in Nashville and took so much effort and so much work that a lot of people kind of did give up. And some of those things just are common sense. They just are. And we need to make that a little bit of a more streamlined process in our city. I also think that reducing speed limits and signage and including a robust, I would call it driver education program for the county would be very beneficial. So I look forward to that coming in. One of the things too that I did want to point out, I used to tell my constituents, I said, y'all are calling me all the time about traffic calming, but none of you have actually signed up for this program. So I'm really glad to see that I pushed my neighborhoods and we did get a lot of applications, and none of those in District 6 made the cut, but I appreciate that at least they made the effort. But I do want to point out to some of my colleagues aren't maybe present at the moment, but to the viewing audience, that by my count, out of those 8 that were selected, they are dispersed throughout the county. There are 2 in East Nashville, Highland Heights and Jones Avenue, which are in District 5, which we know has a huge amount of development going on, so that's appropriate. So there are 2 in East. There are 2 in South Nashville, Haywood South, as well as Caldwell Abbey Hall. There are 2 that are in West Nashville, and there are 2 that are in sort of the North Nashville area, one being the TSU area and the other being Katy Hill, which is a little bit of a bridge between East and North. So I somewhat reject the idea that these were all concentrated, that there was not a dispersal throughout the county. I think that in some cases we need to keep at it and keep working through that process. But just want to encourage people to sort of look at that. Just because your particular area wasn't selected at this time doesn't mean it's not ever going to be, or that we won't get to yet at some point. But I'm with Councilmember Allen. I appreciate having some sort of metrics, because that helps me even with my neighbors to say, like, yes, you do have a problem, but other folks are actually having higher crashes than you are and things like that. And I think that a lot of constituents value that fact-based decision-making when we have very limited resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Withers. Chair Bedney.
So I hope I didn't give you the impression that I was against connectivity. I was just saying that as we see the quote-unquote failures of how the city works in certain areas, that we need to go back and revise and not to use one thing fits all, but to just look at each place in a different way. For example, I have one subdivision is in District 4, and the people that live in that subdivision actually have to get on the car and drive to Nolensville drive south, and then drive into the school when there could be just a walk for people to actually to walk their kids to school. So it shouldn't have to be that the only solution is connectivity. There should be other opportunities for people to move around the city, and that's kind of what I'm saying, that we should have that flexibility. I hope I'm not sounding like I'm accusing the planning department, because I really love what they do. They work really hard, but they have to follow a set of guidelines. And so that's what I'm proposing, that we review those guidelines to make sure that they are more inclusive of what we are learning as we go through this process.
Thank you, Chair Bedney. We have noted that you are the enemy of connectivity. We will go, we will go on to Councilmember Porterfield.
Thank you so much, Chair. I did want to respectfully push back just a little bit, Councilman Withers. The community, the Caldwell Abbey Hall community, from my understanding, is located off 12th Avenue South, and is that not the correct? It's off Hardin Place? Hardin and Trousdale? Okay, because I'm looking at a map here, and it's showing 12th Avenue South, so is that not the correct? And well, looking at this map that was provided, it does not appear when we're looking at the southeast Nashville area that it is no representation for our particular community. However, the concerns that we were expressing were not due to none of our neighborhoods being chosen for this project. So I just wanted to make sure that that is duly noted, that we do have concerns about the process, but it's not necessarily because our communities did not get selected.
Do we need to send Derek back there to settle fisticuffs?
Please.
Councilmember Porterfield, I understand the pushback. Did you want to make any other points or have any other questions? All right, I can tell that Jeff is getting hungry, and I'm going to allow him to do his presentation on the speed reduction feasibility study.
I'm hanging in there, Councilman. Thank you. We will go through this relatively quickly and then get to your questions. As you know, this was in a response to an ordinance that was given to us to provide a feasibility study, and so that's what this has done. That feasibility study is also available on our website, and I think you all have copies as well. I did want to give a little bit of background here with respect to Vision Zero. That term is used a lot in that study and has been thrown around a lot in this community, and this is an approach more than anything that goes back some 20 years. It is started internationally, and it has made its way to America, and a number of cities have jumped in with both feet. We are not represented here in this map, but certainly we hold to the ideals of Vision Zero with a lot of work that we do. And what Vision Zero says is, it says, you know, for a long time we have prioritized vehicle movement and efficiency in our transportation networks over safety. And so the Vision Zero concept says, yes, we need movement, but more than that, and what we need to prioritize is safe movement. And the example I like to use is thinking about intersection design. Instead of immediately looking at a traffic signal, we look more at roundabouts. The idea being that roundabouts, if crashes do occur, are very much less impact, lower severity. You think about the types of crashes that occur, they're more like side swipes and less like T-bones. And so that's the idea behind Vision Zero. Speed is a major part of that. There's no question from anybody, really, on any side of this, thinking about these philosophies, that speed is detrimental to safety. The higher the speed, the more likely that crashes will occur, and if they do occur, that they will be more severe. And so that's one reason why we are looking at a speed limit reduction in Metro Nashville. As was pointed out earlier, also, it would be great to be able to say yes to all of these neighborhoods. We simply cannot do that, and so we do have to have some prioritization. But in this effort, we don't have to prioritize nearly as much. We can take a much larger swath of the residents of Davidson County and say, this is the type of thing we hear you, and this is the type of thing we're working on that being a lower speed limit in residential areas. Central to the idea of Vision Zero are these four E's: education, engineering, enforcement, and evaluation. And what we do at Public Works, probably more than any of these, is center on the engineering part. We study this, and we have engineers that look at this. What we're not as well versed in is educating the public, messaging this, PR types of outreach efforts for this. We certainly don't get into the enforcement area, but we partner a lot, as been noted here tonight, with MNPD. And then we do some evaluation on the back end as well. But these four E's are all critical to having a successful safety program, whether we call it Vision Zero or whatever we decide to call it. I have a couple of different types of images here, because these are the types of projects that we are doing, all with the idea of we are trying to make our streets safer. So whether or not we call it Vision Zero, just know that a lot of the work that we do, whether it's these programs or any of our other work that we're doing at Public Works, always has that safety component in mind. This discussion about lower speed limits goes back at least 3 years. Some of you all will say it's been in the works probably much longer than that. But 3 years ago, we began our look at it with what we call the Walking District Program. And this was 3 neighborhoods in unique portions of Davidson County, that is having unique land use characteristics and so forth. And we essentially just lowered the speed limit. We did do a little bit of a unique signage and some marking, but for the most part, the biggest part of this was that we lowered the speed limit on residential and a few collector streets as well, and then measured the impacts of that. We measured that 2 ways. We looked at qualitative data, and we also looked at quantitative data. And quantitatively, we did that by survey, and we asked questions like this. I know it's a little hard to see, but we asked questions. Was this too slow? Are these types of speed limits in residential streets or on collector streets too slow? Overwhelmingly, they said no, they are not too slow. Overwhelmingly, they said they appreciated lower speed limits and the idea, but also overwhelmingly, they said it really didn't make that much difference to us in terms of how the neighborhood felt. So that bottom picture there, when you look at how does it feel safer, it was kind of mixed. It was across the board. We got a really lukewarm reception to that. And then if we asked further questions about, would you support more intensive treatments like traffic calming and those kind of things? They said, yes, we would. Do you think more enforcement would be helpful? Yes, we think it would. So it was always to the tone of we're for lower speed limits, but we recognize that just lowering the speed limit has not gotten us there in most cases in these neighborhoods. This gets really, this is really for the engineers of us and the people who
Councilmember Allen, shout out.
Who really like the data part of it. Suffice it to say, there was some lowering in the speed limit. It was not earth-shattering. So when we look at 85th percentile speeds, which has been pointed out has been the traditional measure of how we set speed limits, it didn't change much at all. But when we looked at average speed, which I think for many of us is just more understandable and makes a lot of sense, we did find a decrease in the average speed at 20 of the 29 locations where we collected before and after data in these 3 neighborhoods. The average decrease when we saw one was about 1.5 miles an hour. But we also saw a trend, and what this is intended to show, and I won't get into the details, but you'll have to kind of trust me and you can ask me about it later, is that we saw a trend from higher speeds shifting into lower speeds. So when we looked at things like how much of the traffic was going faster than 35 miles an hour, we saw that drop in some cases by 20 or more percentage points, the amount of traffic that was going at a relatively unsafe speed. So that did seem to have more of an impact, and it was very consistent on almost every speed location that we measured. And that gave us a really good feel for the fact that this did have some impact, even in the short 8-month duration that we had this in. So our recommendation, skipping to the to that part of it, is from an engineering standpoint that we would reduce the speed limit, both existing and presumably the de facto speed limit for new streets, to 25 miles an hour from a standard speed limit of 30 miles an hour on residential local streets within the urban services district. So that's probably a mouthful, but we look at the USD as being a proxy or a surrogate for urbanized areas where we know this speed limit is more appropriate. Now, as we get out to some of the outlying parts of Davidson County, if we look at what are classified as local roads in those areas, they feel like country roads, many of them, and we feel like the speed limit going to 25, those is going to be much more difficult to achieve than it will be in more urban built-up areas. The other positive aspect of that is that's also in the urban areas where we see more bicycle movement, pedestrian traffic, and those types of things. So everything is kind of conspiring to us and working with planning and some of their transportation planners to take this first step of thinking about a speed limit reduction in the USD. Again, that would only be on streets classified by the Major Collector Street Plan as local streets. That's about 65% of our county's roadway centerline miles. We think that constitutes about 2,800 signs that would have to be switched out as part of this effort. And the question came up earlier about the cost of that. The report does indicate a cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million, maybe a little less. We do think that's a conservative estimate. We would hope that between our inventory and our plan development and getting a contractor to switch those signs out might come in a little under that. That's not the only recommendation in the study. That is the primary one from an engineering standpoint. But as in the course of developing these feasibility studies, this feasibility study, it became very clear to us looking, and there are a lot of case studies, peer city studies, and that type of thing. It became very clear to us that if we just do a speed limit reduction in a vacuum without context of those other E's that we talked about, the education component and the enforcement component specifically, that we may not be as effective as we would like to be. And so that's number two there, that we work with someone, we'll talk about that, someone to develop a larger suite of improvements that complement the lowering of the speed limit reduction. And those are in the report. A number of ideas are given for the types of education outreach efforts that other cities have done, for instance. And so, you know, we feel like we need to be working with someone in developing a lot of those. That's generally not our strong suit. And so that gets to recommendation number 3, which is that we begin working towards a task force to help us with that, and that would also include members of MNPD from an enforcement standpoint, public, council, advocacy groups. It could be a number of things, and there are a number of different models that have been used in cities across the United States as they have embarked on a true and more robust Vision Zero campaign. This would be a big part of it. There's no question, but there are also, we believe, aspects that need to come along with that. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Light them up, folks.
I have a question.
All right, Chair Bedney.
So you're saying that on your second item that enforcement will be important to make this happen. So can we ask the Nashville Police Department what measures are they going to take to enforce this 25-mile-an-hour limit?
Probably very similar to what we've already done in the studies, not the studies, but the 3 projects they did, the walking neighborhoods, the pilot programs. What we did for those is we went into each one of those areas right after they implemented the reduced speed limit, and we just started making traffic stops. We started off educating people, warning them, letting them know, hey, you may not have known this, but are you aware that the speed limit was reduced down to 25 miles per hour or 20 miles per hour in some areas, and just informing them. Then We left the area and we came back short time later and did the same thing over again, only we issued tickets and citations. And we went to each one of those areas and conducted the same type of operation. So we would probably do something very similar, take a time period where we were very lenient, warned folks, educated them on the changes in the speed limit and why it was being done, and then follow up at a later time with more stringent enforcement.
Thank you. And do you have a cost of the added expense of doing enforcement on all the USD for this program, either one of you? I think you budgeted $1 million. Did that include police enforcement?
No, it did not, and we have not included that. I mean, and one reason is because we didn't want to develop this with the assumption that there would be more enforcement. You know, I think it is one approach would be we change these and don't change any of the enforcement and continue to monitor that. Our pilot project lasted, as I said, about 8 months, and you know, I think there's something to be said for consistency. That was in 3 neighborhoods, so should we expect there to be a great deal of compliance with the speed limit? We're not sure, but we do think that the more widespread this is and the longer that it is, it becomes the new normal for drivers in Nashville, and you don't come to expect it as a speed limit change. It's just the speed limit. And so we don't necessarily assume that there would be any more enforcement than there is now, but that's another place where we feel like this, a committee and working with more heads thinking about this issue would be helpful to us.
And then one more question, Co-Chair.
Absolutely.
I don't think you understand what happens on the rural roads on Davidson County if you think that speeding is not an issue there. I mean, we have some dramatic trucks going at 60 miles an hour in narrow rural roads. So we have a huge speeding problem on the thoroughfares on Cane Ridge, for example, and Council Lady Porfield can probably back me up on that. We see a big problem. So I think you might want to consider expanding this to the whole city instead of the USD.
Thank you, Chair Bedney. And I'm going to go to Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Public Works for responding to the Metro ordinance and working with us on developing one that y'all could be successful with. I feel like it's been good information that's been gathered. In my area, it's been received very positively. I mean, the data that you showed just from the survey of people absolutely being very desirous of lower speed limits is something I continue to hear from people. And I would say the only feedback negative that I've gotten has been from folks in the far reaches of the county saying, you're crazy, you shouldn't lower my speed limit out here. So, I mean, clearly I think we've got to maybe do some more data gathering and trying to figure out how to deal with the issues out there. And then I also want to thank the police department for working with us just in terms of, we've all known that it's going to be sporadic enforcement, but I think just the unpredictability of it makes it work. And y'all have been really great about working through our community coordinator officer when neighbors point out an area that's having a problem. Sergeant Coker's been great about getting somebody to show up in that area for a while, and then it moves to somewhere else. So, I mean, I know we can't have enforcement everywhere all the time, but I appreciate the responsiveness of showing up wherever we've asked you to show up, which seems to be a reasonable way to deal with limited resources. So I'm appreciative that we're willing to give this a try, and I think that people are looking forward to having the speed limits officially lowered and just making it safer for our children and pedestrians. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. I'm going to go to Councilmember Withers.
Thank you, Councilmember O'Connell. To Councilmember Bedney's point, I definitely understand what you are referring to, and I would agree with Councilmember Allen that what I recall hearing from Councilmembers Rosenberg and Henderson, and Councilmember Henderson certainly is an advocate of traffic calming in neighborhoods, but what we've heard from them is that in the more kind of rural areas of the county that this approach wouldn't necessarily be effective and that you might need to look at a different approach out there. And so That doesn't say that we're ignoring that issue. It's just saying that this solution is potentially more beneficial, at least in the short term and at a lower cost, to be rolled out in a comprehensive way in the Urban Services District. And it appears that quite a bit of District 31 is outside of the Urban Services District. Is that correct? And I know my boss lives technically in Nolensville, but on the Davidson County side, and I thank him for his tax dollars all the time. But he's in that area, and so I know based on that feedback that I hear from my boss most mornings, what that experience is like out there. But that's it. It's just trying to find a solution. We can't. This county is so large and has so many different contexts that there's never going to be one solution that fits everything. But I believe that this is a good starting point for the Urban Services District. I would echo that, provided that switching out the signs is also coordinated with a robust public driver education program. Just informing people, how to use four-way stop signs and things like that would go a long way, in my experience. But so I would encourage everyone to start with this, and then maybe keep thinking about what might work for some of those rural areas where a 25-mile-per-hour speed limit would probably be viewed as being ridiculous by a lot of drivers and would very likely be ignored. We'll see to what extent it's adhered to even in the Urban Services District, but it's a start. I've just never lived anywhere where 30 miles per hour was considered legal and appropriate on very, very narrow streets that have on-street parking and all sorts of things going on. So I just think this is a start. It seems like working with a contractor to roll it out in a relatively short time period in a coordinated way, I think is a really good part of the program, and just hope that everyone will work together to find at least a partial solution for at least the majority of the county where the majority of our population lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Withers. Moving on to Councilmember Porterfield.
Thank you so much. I do want to agree with Councilman Bettany. We do have a lot of concerns out in our area with the speed limit, and obviously, I've only been a council person for about 3 weeks now. However, speeding is something that has consistently been brought to my attention. Our particular district is primarily USD. However, we do have parts of our district that are GSD, and our neighbors are consistently complaining about the speeding. Unfortunately, parts of our area have turned into a mini NASCAR speedway. Our neighbors are consistently having concerns about the safety on streets like Castlegate and Anderson Road, Wendell, Smith Springs, Hamilton Church. They're consistently having those safety concerns. So in agreement with Councilman Bettany, we would ask that you all would consider some of those GSD. And again, this is not just as a benefit for my district, because my district is primarily USD. However, other parts of Southeast Nashville, which are falling into GSD, are having some of those complaints about speeding as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Porterfield. I'm going to follow up with a couple of questions for Jeff. Jeff, you mentioned at the outset of your presentation that we are not on the Vision Zero map. Is that something best left to Public Works, the mayor's office, and why are we not, and do we intend to be?
Well, I think the question arises, who is the keeper of Vision Zero? That is coming from a website called the Vision Zero Network, and they were a consortium of concerned individuals, a nonprofit, whose task is whose aim is to increase that. So we're not registered with them. It's just a matter of demonstrating our commitment to that. But I think a big part of that, and I think if we wanted to go through those steps, we'd be hard pressed to do that without a Vision Zero committee or somebody that regularly meets and talks about those types of things. As with most of our committees, I guess we are certainly staff resources to that. But as far as how it gets starts to get traction and gets developed, I think that's why we are presenting that for discussion.
Got it. Thank you. And then maybe sort of a follow-up question there is, you've got the specific recommendation for a task force. That does not necessarily preclude, though, the recommendation to go ahead with the the speed limit reduction initiative in the USD, does it?
Not necessarily. I mean, we think that's the most prudent approach from an engineering standpoint, but if we are to begin to roll out messaging that goes along with that, which we think is important to do somehow, that's where we would look for some guidance on how best to do that. Is it bumper stickers or yard signs or special meetings like this one, or just what is it that helps us to communicate to people while we're doing this, the importance of it, and request to honor that speed limit reduction.
Got it. Thank you. Councilmember Syracuse.
Just for clarity, we passed legislation to ask you to do this report. Thank you, you did it. You've, in the report, indicated it's basically going to cost us $1 million. Am I correct in that it's on us now to find you the $1 million?
That's certainly one aspect to it, but...
I believe it's on you personally, Councilmember Syracuse.
Well, the 15th district does have about 35% of all the hotel bed taxes in the county.
All of mine are going to the TDZ, so that's good.
Given if we had funding in our hands right now, we would still have those same concerns about, how do we, is there an additional enforcement component that needs to go with this? If so, we have had some discussions with Metro Police, primarily the community coordinators. They were very receptive to the idea because, as has been pointed out, they are the ones that are on the front lines dealing with these issues and with the request from neighborhoods to have more enforcement. And so our latest information from them was that they were very supportive, but the question remains, is there additional enforcement that needs to come along with it? And if so, how do you fund that, and where does that come from?
Good question, Councilmember Syracuse. Thank you. Chair Bedney, anything else?
No, I just want to thank Public Works, the Metro Police Department, and Planning, and the council members for coming here in a lovely day to share with us how to try to fix transit and traffic in the city.
Thank you, Chair Bedney. I want to also just say this is a joint committee meeting thanks to the curiousness and commitment of Councilman Bedney. As Chair of Planning and Zoning Historical, he's also a member of the Public Works Committee and suggested that this be a joint committee because there is so much that is drawn from the planning process that impacts these issues. So thank you to him. I'll echo his thanks to all staff who joined us as our colleagues. And again, this will be archived on the Metro Nashville Network website. Thank you to everybody for attending. That'll end tonight's committee meeting.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.